So, what are some of the themes relevant to this notion of planning that Hayek is so worried about in his work? Well, as we have seen, giving up freedom is essential to the kind of planning that Hayek talks about, and we are experiencing it very much right now. In order to get with the plan, in order for the plan to work, like for example the plan now to limit the spread of coronavirus, we have to give up freedom very significantly right now because perhaps you are self-isolating, you're keeping distance from other people, you're not going places that you otherwise would go. This means you are making sacrifices, but you're willing to make those sacrifices because ultimately you trust your government, or that at least is the hope. And perhaps the degrees of responsiveness, or the different degrees of responsiveness we see in different countries, are in some way a measure of how great this trust in the government really is. A desire for leadership. We want to feel like leadership is in the right hands, like power is in the right hands, because we only want to be obedient to people, again, we trust to get the job done and do it right. This, of course, then has everything to do with power. We give people more power, like in Hungary already mentioned. Viktor Orban gets a lot of power. We notice how much power the state has, or in fact lacks. A lot of planning is about power. And in times of central planning, where one central entity plans the lives of many, we feel this power very acutely, where maybe normally in peacetime or when there's not a pandemic, we are not as aware of this power, and perhaps this power is also less great. The power tends to grow the more urgent the crisis becomes. This in turn leads us to talk about autonomy. Because if you make sacrifices, if you give up your freedom, there is the question of how much autonomy remains for you as an individual. Can you decide for yourself? Can you think for yourself? We certainly like to believe that we do, but this for Hayek and many other thinkers with him has everything to do with education. Because you, of course, can feel like you are autonomous, like you are freely making decisions, but you're always making decisions, you're always thinking your thoughts based on the information you already have. And what is that information? Is it of a good quality? Is it true? Is it scientifically true? Is it based on faith? Is it based on religion? Is it based on wishful thinking, etc.? We'll talk more about education and the connection to information and knowledge in a moment. As we've also seen in Hayek's story, there is the issue of scapegoating, and I'll give you a few examples in a moment of how this plays out right now as well. Finally, the issue of propaganda. Hayek very explicitly talks about propaganda in wartime, and he is of course referring to Nazi Germany and how propaganda was used to paint a particular picture of especially the scapegoats, right? He mentions anti-Semitism. A very important point here is to wonder, where does state planning, where does the communications we receive from the state, where are they, if we can use that word, objective, or where are they skewed? Where are they meant to influence us, nudge us, if you want to use a more popular term nowadays? Is it actual information, or is it information slanted in a way to scare us into something, to make us behave, to force obedience? There are a lot of gray zones here. I want to talk a little bit about that. Now, this is a sign you've probably seen, or some version of it somewhere, right? We are now asked to keep a distance. Many of us are sticking with that, even though, as you've probably heard, many governments are using a version of what Rutte is saying in the Netherlands, that if we have to make 100% of the decisions with only 50% of the information. In the US, you have to stay 6 feet apart, which is more than 1.5 meters. There is a degree of arbitrariness many of us feel in these rules, and yet we need some kind of rules in order to lead any kind of life now at all. Here you have some roadblocks in Italy. Again, when are these decisions made? When are these decisions made? And do we stick by these decisions that are made by the people in power? Or again, we tend to only do that if we trust they are right, and if we are sufficiently fearful ourselves of the consequences of breaking these rules. This is a sign from a US nail studio. Sorry, we don't accept Chinese customers for coronavirus. Thanks for understanding. Where can we draw the line between very commonsensical measures that individuals take themselves, and where does it turn into straight out racism? As you know, President Trump refers to coronavirus as the Chinese virus, as a foreign virus, and you see here the beginning of the kind of scapegoating that Hayek is so worried about in his text as well. You hear stories about Chinese Americans, Chinese Dutch people, people of Asian descent living in different countries who are being attacked verbally and physically because supposedly they are bringers of the virus. And protests, of course, against the same thing. So here we come back to that issue of education. If you look at that sign all the way to the left, time for science, not rumors, education is incredibly important because our fear will lead us to jump to conclusions, to make certain assumptions, and perhaps make shortcuts in our thinking, coming to conclusions that are not at all justified, backed up by science or common sense, but yet the uncertainty tends to encourage us to be more rash than perhaps we would be under normal circumstances. This probably reminds you too of our earlier discussions about angst, right? It's like something we feel in the absence of certainty. We talked about how you have no grip on reality, meaning is not self-evident anymore. This is a breeding ground, we can now say, for mistrust, xenophobia, and scapegoating. Angst is so profoundly uncomfortable that we would rather be afraid. So in order to channel our angst, we might then choose a group of people to be afraid of and to condemn, because this has the dual advantage of us getting rid of our angst and swapping it out for fear, and also having a scapegoat that we can focus on, so we may band together with people who are not like that scapegoat. I mentioned Orban already several times. Here's the headline from the New York Times a few days ago. For autocrats and others, coronavirus is a chance to grab even more power. Remember that desire for leadership we have in times like this. The desire for leadership can lead us to give more power to a strong man, as Hayek would call him, to get stuff done. Leaders around the world, right, this is from the article, have passed emergency decrees and legislation expanding their reach during the pandemic. Will they ever relinquish them? According to Hayek, once you give somebody that much power, once you centralize power, in other words, in one instantiation or in one person, chances are they are not going to want to give up that power once the crisis is over, once the war is over. This, for Hayek, is simply too dangerous. This is why he argues for decentralized power under any circumstances, economically and politically. So going back to the outline discussed before, we see here how these three things go together. Democracy, knowledge, economics, in times of peace, in times of war, and in times of the corona crisis, the times we are living through right now. And it has everything to do with liberty or freedom and power. Knowledge is power. Democracy has everything to do with power. And we can democratically decide to give power to a central entity. And of course, the economics coming into it, we're talking about here not so much the economic consequences. Of course, there's great fears of a recession or even a depression as a result of the corona crisis. We are more interested in that link established by Hayek between economics and democracy. And we'll have to talk more about that in a moment. So having talked a little bit about democracy and the threats to it in times such as the ones we are experiencing now, we want to talk a little bit more about knowledge and economics and how they hang together. Now, here's a quote from Hayek that I want you to look at carefully. In ordinary language, he says, we describe by the word planning the complex of interrelated decisions about the allocations of our available resources, right? So think about the situation right now. Planning needs to be made about how many ventilators are being produced, where they're being produced, where they end up. These are scarce resources right now. They need to be allocated correctly. All economic activity, the quote continues, is in this sense planning. And in any society in which many people collaborate, this planning, whoever does it, will in some measure have to be based on knowledge, which in the first instance is not given to the planner but to somebody else, which somehow will have to be conveyed to the planner. So, to use a very concrete example right now, it is the people in the field, right? The people in the hospitals, the people in the homes for the elderly who know what the situation is like on the ground. And the information they have needs to be communicated to the central authority who decides who gets the ventilators, who gets more beds, who gets more personnel, etc. There's a great scarcity of resources. These need to be distributed correctly, and we can only do that if we have the proper knowledge based on which we can make those kinds of decisions. We need to, in other words, plan, but Hayek warns us when we think of planning, we almost automatically these days think of central planning. Okay, the information needs to go to a central point so that from up on high, the right decisions can be made about who gets what. Hayek wants to draw our attention that this centralized planning is not the only way. So the answer to the question, centralized planning or not, has everything to do with knowledge because, Hayek argues, knowledge is often actually lost in the communication, if it has to be communicated rather to a central entity. A lot of the relevant knowledge will get lost. So in answer to the question, centralized planning or not, Hayek would most certainly answer not. Another long quote, and bear with me here as I try to unpack that a little bit. Which of these systems, that is to say, the centralized system and the decentralized system, is likely to be more efficient depends mainly on the question under which of them we can expect that fuller use will be made of the existing knowledge. Okay, so the optimal system, centralized or decentralized, which one we pick will depend on how we make the best use of our knowledge. Is that in one system or in the other? And this, in turn, depends on whether we are more likely to succeed in putting at the disposal of a single central authority all the knowledge which ought to be used, but which is initially dispersed among many different individuals. So again, how likely is it, Hayek asks us, that the knowledge dispersed under all the different individuals, different doctors, different nurses, all kinds of people in the service, in the care industry, rather, how likely is it that that very individual concrete knowledge can be communicated appropriately to a central authority who then can make the right decisions? So it depends on whether we are more likely to succeed in putting this at the disposal of a central authority or in conveying to the individuals such additional knowledge as they need in order to enable them to fit their plans with those of others. So we're talking here about the direction of knowledge. Knowledge will flow from concrete situations and individuals in those situations to the central authority, but knowledge, of course, also flows between those individuals. And is it better to give one central authority the power, or perhaps have it decentralized and have different loci, different focal points, different points of power and control where decisions can be made on, so to speak, lower levels? Now, Hayek warns us that our thinking becomes planned in the situation where there is only one central authority. He wants to encourage individuals to think for themselves because his great worry is that if you give the power to one central authority, this might initially give us a sense of safety and security, but it will prevent us, or it will make us harder and harder to think for ourselves because we simply do not have the relevant information. The information flow is directly to the central authority, and we leave all the power to the central authority, not making decisions for ourselves anymore. So you can think about the so-called intelligent lockdown in the Netherlands, where the intelligence presumably refers to our intelligence as individuals to use our common sense in situations to act appropriately. But Hayek says we can only act appropriately, we only can use our common sense when we have sufficient information.